Some people try and jump straight in and just start making offers and analyzing things, but they don't really know what they're looking for. Once you've defined your buy box, in this case, the volume game becomes, okay, how can I find as many deals that fit that buy box as possible? You don't necessarily want to just go scraping the internet trying to force things into your buy box. You have to emotionally detach yourself from it and just say that everything that meets these parameters, I'm going to analyze, and I'm going to do it consistently. Welcome back to our special podcast series, The 20-Minute Investor, where we bring you actionable nuggets and insights from our real estate investing journeys in bite-sized 20-minute episodes. I'm Aaron Amin. My wife and I built a portfolio of 8 cash-flowing rentals across 3 states while working full-time and raising a young family.
And I'm Nathan. I'm a husband, father, a tech executive who built a portfolio of cash-flowing rentals across 2 states from over 2,000 miles away.
Together, we co-founded the Remote Real Estate Academy, where we coach investors on how to build their own portfolios of cash-flowing rentals from anywhere in the world. Today's episode is a fun one. We're going to talk about how to analyze a rental deal in 5 minutes or less, literally. So no spreadsheets, no getting too deep in the weeds, just a quick and dirty process using free tools to know if it's worth a closer look. So this is actually one of the kind of core tenets of our program is we teach people the fundamentals of how to understand what makes a good deal. They build a buy box and learn, what their parameters are to try and meet their goals. But then there's a kind of the middle of our initial accelerator is largely about a volume game of just analyzing deals as much as possible. We say 90 deals in 90 days and then putting offers in on the ones that make sense. So the piece we're going to, kind of unpack is like, how does one get into that rhythm of high volume analysis without getting too emotionally attached? So Nathan, why don't you kick it off?
It's a juicy topic, as you said. A lot of stuff to say about this. I think it all starts with focus, I guess, for me at least. And focus meaning, as we talk about and as we teach, right? But it's like picking a specific market. And when we say market, it's more granular than, city X. It's neighborhoods or one neighborhood in city X, right? And not only that, it's also focusing on the very specific asset or property type that you set up kind of through your buy box or that you're interested in, I guess. And then it's getting intimately familiar with that neighborhood or those neighborhoods and that type of property. And keeping that focus allows you over time to become the expert in that property type, in those or that, neighborhood, those neighborhoods, that zip code, those zip codes, so that you can execute like a back of the napkin, quote unquote, or cursory, whatever you want to call it, deal analysis in, less than 5 minutes. I think it becomes tremendously hard to do that and to do it well if you're looking at 3 different cities, 10 different neighborhoods across those 3 cities, if you're looking at single family homes, if you're looking at duplexes, if you're looking at quads. And I would say it starts with that even before getting into tools or spreadsheets or any other analysis, mechanisms or tools that you could be using, calculators, whatever it is that you could be using to do your quick analysis. And I say that simply because, for example, because we've been so focused on like the same type of properties and the same 5 zip codes for the last 6 or 7 years now, when Zillow sends me an email and says, hey, this new property came up for sale, I don't even need to do more than just scan the Zillow listing to see whether or not it ballpark is something I should spend more time on or not. For example, a property listed for, making this one up, but $300,000 in kind of the zip codes and neighborhoods that we typically look at, I know right off the bat that it will not cash flow and reach the return goals that we are looking for unless I got it for maybe 60 to 70% off. Right, which is a pretty tall order. If I get 5 Zillow emails with 5 new listings in these zip codes, and one of them's $300,000 and the others are closer to the $150,000, $200,000 mark or whatever, I can quickly skip over that $300,000 property and spend a bit more time focusing on the others, right? And then there's more, but maybe I'll start there. I think it starts with focus for me. Really focus on that one kind of area and one property type.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And so basically, I think kind of the quick summary of what you're saying is like you have to know what you're looking for in order to be able to get quick enough and understand how to view things in a quicker, right? If you're just looking at one property, if you just spin the wheel on Zillow and scroll to some random city and pick a random neighborhood and a random house, you're not going to know what you're looking at. even if you understand, oh, it's a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house, those mean completely different things in different neighborhoods and markets. So what comes to mind to me is there's a framework. So I'm in a group with Brian Lubin from Action Academy, and he talks about this framework that has, ever since he shared it, it's always stuck with me. I think it really applies here, called the CVC framework: clarity, volume, consistency. So what Nathan just described is clarity, right? It's like spending the upfront time to understand what you're actually looking for. Because if you don't have that clarity, then you could be taking you're putting in a bunch of reps, but moving in an unclear direction. And that makes it really hard to get to your end outcome. So by taking the time up front to get really clear on what it is that you need to be finding in order to meet your goals, that is probably some of the best spent effort that you can make. Some people try and jump straight in and just start, making offers and analyzing things, but they don't really know what they're looking for or what they're aiming for. That's a good way to waste effort. And especially in a 20-minute investor mindset, like we don't have time to waste. The second part of that is volume. So once you've defined your buy box, in this case, the volume game becomes, okay, how can I find as many deals that fit that buy box as possible? You don't necessarily want to just go scraping the internet trying to force things into your buy box. Your buy box is specific for a reason. So if you pick 3 zip codes and a set of neighborhoods, then you're going to want to just make sure you're paying attention to those so that when things come through, you're able to analyze them. But you have to emotionally detach yourself a little bit from it and just say that everything that meets these parameters, I'm going to analyze, and I'm going to do it consistently, which is the final one, which is just, basically making a commitment that if I'm clear on what I'm looking for, if I'm putting in the reps, and if I do it for long enough, it will result in a deal that fits my strategy. So I've always liked that framework as a way to think about it, because it's too easy to get attached emotionally or start chasing deals just because you're impatient and you want one. But I do think that if you take the time to kind of put things in the lens of that framework, that success is more or less inevitable if you've done the work, the right way. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I never thought of it through the lens of that framework, I guess. But yeah, that's exactly what it is. And I was thinking of another thing you touched on. It's like we talked about, how do you analyze a rental in 5 minutes? And, we talked about this in previous episodes as well. But, if you're looking at several markets, several cities, several states potentially, right? One could argue that it's maybe even impossible to analyze properly in 5 minutes, primarily for the reasons that in each of those markets, cities, counties, or states, you'll have pretty significant variables in things like, property taxes and things like insurance and things like potentially management fees or whatever, that just make it impossible if you're not focused, because they'll be different, and you're looking at analyzing apples and oranges. If you're looking at 2 different markets, maybe making your analysis, your spreadsheet, or your tool work for you when in fact that rental's not a viable one, or not one that meets your investment returns.
Yeah, it harkens back to the episode. We did one on cash flow and one on property management. And those are where you really fine tune your numbers. So like if you're looking in a, let's say, Class C neighborhood in a, kind of standard Midwest city, and there's, high turnover in that market where, the occupancy is a bit lower, vacancy is a bit higher, the property manager you hire is very important, because they might be able to overperform against the kind of citywide data, because they're really good at operations, they're really good at finding tenants. And then inversely, right, like if you have a bad property manager, even in a good market, that could drag down your numbers. And so just knowing what you're working with, like the market, the kind of economics, and the just general market factors as to like what the tenant profiles are in that area, and then who's on your team and how well can they perform. Like those are the things that make the most difference in the margins. And if you don't know those, then your 5-minute analysis could be based on some comps that you scrape from, one of these software tools, but you have no idea if it's accurate because you haven't built a team, you haven't gathered any data. So I do think that's
100%.
a really important call out, because there's, especially in this day and age, there's so many software tools, and they all have their own algorithms, they all have their own databases that they're pulling information from, and the comps that you get can sometimes be misleading. I know we already talked about that previously too, but if the software is pulling from a geographic radius, but that radius crosses a main street into a different part of town, and it's pulling comps in from that, it can distort. And I've noticed that in our markets. I know you and I both use Deal Check, and we've had, like that's our go-to tool for deal analysis. But even then, I'm auditing and looking at the map of the comps that Deal Check's pulling in, and I'm making sure I uncheck things when I see that it crossed that street, right, or into a different
100%.
area, so that those comps don't get distorted. So I guess the next like logical place here to go is, what are the tools? What are the ways? So let's just assume that somebody has spent the time getting clear on what they're looking for and that they have a buy box and they're getting ready to go into the volume phase. What are the tools and that you use, and how can you kind of fine tune those to really fit it in within 5 minutes?
Yeah, I guess the first one, maybe it's part of kind of defining your buy box, but maybe for the sake of clarity here, I think for me it starts with your online MLS access tool, whether it's Zillow, Realtor, or Redfin, but it's actually setting up a saved search that matches your criteria. So again, type of property, number of rooms, bedrooms, bathrooms, square footage, zip code, school ratings, all that stuff. So define your buy box, save it as a saved search pick your favorite tool of choice, right? In my case, I just happen to use Zillow, so that anytime a property that meets that criteria or matches that particular buy box, I get an immediate notification about it. So typically that's where the volume piece comes in, is like I'll do when I wake up in the morning. It's one of the first things that I do is pull up my email, and I have, the 5, 6, 3, 10, 15, it depends on the day, emails from Zillow of all the properties that were listed or that have had a change, like price increase, price decrease, on, off market type, any type of activity on a property that matches my buy box. So that's where my volume comes in. And then, just like I was mentioning in my example earlier, I can scan through those emails where I could quickly see something that's way overpriced for it to work. I can kind of park it. I don't necessarily ignore it completely, but I don't spend much time on that. Just like some properties that are priced way too low, which might sound or seem counterintuitive, but oftentimes properties that are priced way too low, comparatively speaking, either they're not in a good neighborhood, and the search failed me in that case, or they're just like full rehabs, which is not something I'm interested in. So I can just quickly scan through that, let's call it, 10 emails that I got that morning, and filter out kind of the extremes. And then that narrows it down to, the 3, 4, 5, whatever it is, properties that are more likely to be spot on in the middle of kind of my buy box. And then I would typically take that over either to a spreadsheet like the one we have in the academy. It's, spreadsheets can seem complicated, but once you get used to it, they're not. It's, change 5, 6 values here and there, and you've got your rough back of napkin first pass. Or use a tool like Deal Check, right? I mean, I use Deal Check now more so than my spreadsheet, primarily because it's just really, really fast at doing stuff. And we're talking about how to do it in 5 minutes. And it has the advantage that you can go in and specify what your investment criteria and return on investment criteria are, what your typical fees are, property management, mortgage rates, insurance, taxes, stuff like that. And then just do a real quick import. And then you get a rough first look at what those numbers are. And that's how I do volume. And then when I narrow the funnel down to the 1 or 2 that seem most promising, so closest to, or that match exactly my return goals and stuff like that, then I will kind of move outside of that quick 5-minute, phase and do deeper due diligence. But maybe that's a topic for another conversation.
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand the difference between this kind of 5-minute analysis and due diligence. They're two very different motions that involve a completely different level of effort and detail, right? I think what we're looking for in this 5-minute process, whether it's a spreadsheet or a software tool, is a kind of a red light, green light. Is this worth continuing to spend time on? Because, a 20-minute investor mindset, we don't have hours per day to just sift through listings and go, deep analyze every single deal. So we're just looking for that quick kind of pulse check. Now, some people use things like the 1% rule, or maybe they have a specific cash flow target. Like there's a number of different ways that you can personally measure whether something's worth looking into or not. But like Nathan mentioned, our Remote Real Estate Academy spreadsheet is not that complex. There's only a few values that you have to change. And there literally is a red or green indicator. If the values are, if your return metrics are met, it's green. If they're not, it's red. And just because it's red based on whatever the list price is, you can also tweak some of those variables and say, well, if I were to offer at this price, that's what it would take to get to a green light. So there is some maneuvering too. We're not just plugging the list price in and saying, well, this makes sense or it doesn't. Pretty much nothing makes sense at the list price in this day and age, in most markets. So there's also an art to seeing like, okay, am I going to have to offer at a 50% of the list price in order to get my return metrics? If so, then you have to decide if that's worth your time bothering everyone, your agent, their agent, and ruffling feathers with the seller. That's a personal decision. Some people, I think, low balls are totally expected, but like just understanding that, the list price is not ultimately that's a starting marker. That's what the seller has said. And very rarely is that the actual price that you will probably include in your offer. So deal check and, the spreadsheet we have, and I'm sure there's other tools that do the same thing. They have the ability to help you calculate what your max offer could be. And that's another like barometer to say, like, is this worth spending time on? If you're only 10 or 15% below the list price and you're able to hit your metrics, then arguably it is worth spending time on. At least start a conversation, maybe get an offer out there or spend an extra 15, 20 minutes digging into it. But yeah, I just wanted to add that nuance because I think one of the traps I see people fall into is they just plug in the list price and then they're like, wow, this is like either a negative return or it's only 1%. This sucks. I'm moving on. And you might be ignoring opportunity if that's the only way you're looking at it.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add there as well is just maybe as a word of caution and mistakes that I know I've done and I've seen a lot of people do is like when you talk about, plugging these properties in a spreadsheet, they're most likely not going to work out for your return goals, as a starting point. One thing to be careful of is when you're doing your analysis or your deeper due diligence is to go in that tool or the spreadsheet and actually tweak the correct numbers. You mentioned maybe if I lower the purchase price, I can meet my investment returns. But I've often seen folks that will go in and start tweaking the wrong numbers. For example, whether you ask your property manager or you find the whatever online tool that tells you, average rent for a property like this in this neighborhood is say $1,500. Then they go into the spreadsheet, and will say, well, guess what? I think this property is better than all the other properties. So I think I could probably get $1,700 rent for this one, which is not realistic, but it works on the spreadsheet math and it makes your property returns look good. And that's kind of an anti-pattern or bad smell to be careful of, right? And you could do the same with, well, if I find a property manager that only has 3% monthly fees, then this property would work. That's not realistic either, most likely, right? So that's just something to be aware of and careful when analyzing deals, to go in and actually tweak what is realistic and to stay conservative. At least that's what you and I do, I believe, and it's a lot of what we like to talk about and teach.
Yeah, it's a good point. So like there are levers you can pull. Purchase price is the easiest one. One of the biggest mistakes I'll mention, which kind of ties back to what we've talked about in previous episodes about cash flow. Some people are like, well, I'll just self-manage. So I'm just going to leave management blank. And in that case, even if you do plan to self-manage, take it from someone who's self-managed for 5 years, eventually you might not want to, right? And if you didn't build your pro forma with management fees in, then you've basically, put yourself in a position where your entire margin is probably going to be eroded when you do go to hire that property manager. So that's just one example of like, don't make assumptions or try and force numbers into a spreadsheet. And, like Nathan said, if you got a tight buy box and you know your market, you know who's on your team, you know what they charge, you know the potential, historical vacancy rates, you know their lease up fees, then you can build that as a template and you're not guessing and you're not going to have to force things. And you really can just focus on the one or two levers that do make sense to pull to make the deal work. Well, good stuff right at the 20-minute mark here. And hopefully people got some value. If you have a different strategy or a different tool that you like, we'd love to hear about it. Drop a comment or shoot us an email, and we will catch you next time.
Thank you for making it to the end of today's episode. As you may know, podcasts are very difficult to grow organically. If you're getting value from today's episode, I'd deeply appreciate if you can take 30 seconds to leave my show a 5-star rating and review. This will go a long way to helping me reach more listeners just like you. Thank you so much in advance.